From Jesse Owens stunning Adolf Hitler in Berlin, to Bob Beamon flying nearly 30 feet through the Mexico City air, to Mary Lou Retton smiling through history in Los Angeles, to Florence Griffith Joyner raising her hands in electric celebration. There have been few more iconic Olympic moments than the two black-gloved fists of Tommie Smith and John Carlos lifted high above the medal stand at the 1968 Summer Olympics in Mexico City. But there was a third man standing there that night. And while his quiet act of solidarity barely registered in America, it did not go unnoticed in his home country of Australia. And he paid for it. 1968 was not calm. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated that April. Robert Kennedy was killed in June. The Vietnam War escalated. Cities burned. Trust in government was thin. Black American athletes were asking a simple question. If we can represent this country on the world stage, why can we not live freely inside it? Out of that tension came the Olympic Project for Human Rights. Some members advocated for a full boycott of the Games. They had demands. Restore Muhammad Ali's boxing title after he refused induction into the military draft. Remove International Olympic Committee President Avery Brundage. Keep apartheid regimes like South Africa and Rhodesia out of the Games, and confront the racism embedded in international sport. This was never just about a race. It was about whether America meant what it said. Tommie Smith and John Carlos chose to compete, but they also chose to protest. They understood the stakes. There were warnings, there was pressure, there were threats. This was not a spontaneous gesture. It was deliberate. They knew the podium was a global stage, and they knew the world would be watching. The 200-meter final was electric. Smith wins gold and a world record. Carlos takes bronze. Between them stands an Australian sprinter, silver medalist, Peter Norman. On that night, the second fastest man in the stadium. He had just run the race of his life. His time remains the Australian national record in the 200 meters. He was not American. He was not black. He did not grow up in the Jim Crow South. But in the Olympic Village, he listened. When Smith and Carlos explained what they intended to do, Norman did not step away. He asked how he could help. When Carlos realized that he had forgotten his gloves, Norman suggested they share a pair, one glove each. That is why Smith raised his right fist and Carlos raised his left. Before walking to the podium, Norman accepted a small circular badge, Olympic Project for Human Rights. He pinned it to his chest. He chose his position before the anthem began. The stadium quieted. The anthem started. Smith raised his right fist. Carlos raised his left. Norman stood still, but the badge remained. He aligned himself publicly with black protesters on the most visible stage in global sport. The image circled the world within hours. The reaction was swift. Smith and Carlos were expelled from the Olympic Village. They returned home to threats and isolation. In Australia, the reaction was different. Less explosive, more restrained, but lasting. After Mexico City, Norman continued competing. In the lead-up to the 1972 Munich Olympics, he believed he had qualifying times that justified selection. Many observers and supporters later argued he was quietly punished for his stand. Australian Olympic officials have maintained that team selection was based strictly on performance standards and the trial results. Whatever the internal reasoning, Peter Norman was not selected for the 1972 Olympic team. He never returned to the Games. His international career gradually faded. Injuries mounted, depression followed. He was not formally banned. He was not publicly condemned in dramatic fashion. He was simply not brought back into the spotlight. Sometimes punishment is loud. Sometimes it is administrative. For decades, the photograph belonged to mostly two men, 2 fists, 2 acts of defiance. Norman's role was often overlooked in American retellings. In Australia, recognition came slowly. When Sydney hosted the Olympic Games in 2000, Norman was not given the kind of official celebratory role many expected for an Olympic silver medalist connected to one of the most famous moments in sports history. The United States track and field team invited him as a guest. Australian Olympic officials later said the situation was more complicated than a simple snub. But the symbolism did not go unnoticed. When Peter Norman died in 2006, Tommie Smith and John Carlos flew to Australia. They served as pallbearers at his funeral. In 2012, the Australian Parliament passed a formal motion apologizing for the way Norman had been treated and acknowledging his role in a significant moment of sporting and human rights history. At San Jose State University, where Smith and Carlos once trained, there is a statue of the Podium. 2 men stand with fists raised. The third space is empty. Visitors are invited to stand where Peter Norman stood, to consider what they would have done. Solidarity is easy when it costs nothing. It becomes harder when it risks opportunity. Harder still when it risks reputation. Norman did not share the same lived experience as Smith and Carlos. He did not grow up under segregation in America. But he recognized injustice when he saw it. He chose alignment anyway. That kind of courage complicates simple narratives because it crosses lines people expect to stay fixed. Nationality, race, comfort. He was not erased because he was irrelevant. He was overlooked because his presence forces a question. What would you have done? History remembers the fists. It should. They were brave. They were loud. They were necessary. But history is rarely made by one kind of courage. Sometimes it roars. Sometimes it stands still. Peter Norman did not raise his fist. He did not lead the protest. He did not command the microphone. He simply chose not to step away. And that choice shaped the rest of his life. When Peter Norman died in 2006, the 2 men beside him in that photograph carried his coffin. Not as a performance, not as a headline, but as a friend. History remembers the image. It should also remember the man who stood beside them. If you're still here, thanks. I've got more stories like this that our school textbooks left out. Drop a like. Hit subscribe. Welcome to the Underground Syllabus.